CJSW 90.9 FM is proud to present our 2025 federal election coverage. CJSW radio broadcasts out of the University of Calgary campus located in Calgary, Alberta, and we would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6.
My name is Kamal Karimi, and in this episode we'll be highlighting how political parties in Canada will approach domestic policies if elected into power. These policies and commitments have been taken from the political platforms released by each of the parties with official party status in the House of Commons, namely the Liberal Party, Conservative Party, New Democratic Party, referred to as the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois, referred to as the Bloc. We'll move through major talking points within the topic and how each party plans on addressing issues within them. We may not be able to cover each of the platforms in the fine detail they go into, so we've linked the platforms within the description of each of these episodes. We encourage people to take time to read through the platforms, but you can keep listening to hear about some of the major points in regards to domestic policies. It's also worth noting that a lot of topics, and arguably all of the topics during an election, can fall under the umbrella of domestic policy. So this episode will specifically focus on the following major issues: housing, government spending, infrastructure, crime and justice, guns, Indigenous communities, and human rights. Topic number 1, housing. The Liberal Party's platform promises that in addition to eliminating GST for first-time homebuyers on new and majorly renovated homes under $1 million, they would create a standalone entity that would act as a developer overseeing the construction of affordable housing in Canada. That entity would supply $25 billion in debt financing and $1 billion in equity financing to, quote, innovative Canadian prefabricated home builders. The Liberals say that they would invest almost $74 million to improve critical housing infrastructure, speed up housing development, and help meet the growing demand for affordable housing in the North. They say they would invest $66 million to build, renovate, and repair hundreds more homes across Nunavut, including for Indigenous peoples and underserved groups. The Liberals are also promising a standalone agency called Build Canada Homes that will act as a developer overseeing the construction of affordable housing in Canada. The Conservative Party are saying that they would cut the GST on new homes up to $1.3 million. They say the GST measure will cost between $3.96 billion and $4.97 billion. They would tie federal funding to cities to the number of housing starts. Cities would be expected to increase the number of houses they build by 15% each year, and they would offer bonuses to cities that surpass that target. The Conservative Party say that for every dollar of development taxes cut, a Conservative-led government would match that amount to a maximum of $25,000 per home for a total possible savings of $50,000. They said that they would sell off 15% of federally owned buildings so the land can be used to build affordable homes. Finally, they would implement a NIMBY, or Not in My Backyard, fine on municipalities that block construction because of, quote, egregious opposition from local residents. The Bloc Québécois party is written entirely in French, and while there's no English version available, we here at CJSW have done our best to try to translate and communicate the most pertinent information from that platform in these podcast episodes. The Bloc wants $1.2 billion from the Canadian Housing Infrastructure Fund to be transferred to Quebec without conditions, and to integrate the funding to an existing program or use it for a new one that would better serve municipalities. The party is also in favor of a GST rebate on new homes for first-time home buyers and wants to eliminate the GST for services related to the purchase of a first home, such as building inspections. According to the NDP, they would put in place a $16 billion strategy to support building affordable homes. They would replace the Housing Accelerator Fund with permanent funding for two new programs, the Canadian Homes Transfer and the Communities First Fund. The party is aiming to build 3 million affordable homes in the next 5 years. They would redesign and double the Public Land Acquisition Fund, investing $1 billion over 5 years to build more rent-controlled homes. They would also set aside all suitable federal crown land in order to build more than 100,000 rent-controlled homes by 2035. They say they would speed up approvals on lands owned by the federal government to build homes sooner, as well as also requiring the CMHC to offer low-interest, public-backed mortgages. The NDP are promising more money for the Rental Protection Fund as well, a federal program that supports community housing projects. Finally, they say that they would, quote, rescue at-risk home building projects impacted by tariffs, with the aim of stabilizing housing markets and creating jobs in construction. Topic number 2, government spending. The Liberal Party say that they would shrink public spending. They would cap the size of the public service and attempt to make government operations more efficient by leveraging AI and machine learning. They would also aim to balance the government's operational spending within 3 years while running a, quote, small deficit on capital spending. The Conservative government would cut government support for businesses and foreign aid. They would also boost the local journalism initiative by $25 million. They would cut the federal public service and have called for public servants to be given clear assignments and be monitored to ensure they're completing tasks. Additionally, the Conservatives say they don't plan big changes to the equalization program. The party say they would introduce a dollar-for-dollar law requiring the government to find $1 of savings for every new dollar spent. Finally, they say that they would eliminate university degree requirements for most federal public service jobs. The Bloc Québécois is against the federal government imposing conditions on transfers to provinces. They would also ask the federal government to transfer oversight of the public dental care program to Quebec. For the NDP, they say to increase government revenue, the party would eliminate bearer shares that hide stock ownership and boost compliance funding to Canada Revenue Agency's enforcement section, dealing with international and corporate taxation. The NDP say it would strive towards balancing the budget, aiming to have a falling debt-GDP ratio within 4 years, but would also be willing to borrow, when required in quotations, to support Canadian families. Finally, the NDP is promising a, quote, path to balance the budget once the U.S. trade war is resolved. Topic number 3, infrastructure. All of the parties have a lot to say about infrastructure and how they would approach it. The Liberals say that they would create a first mile fund to build transportation networks to connect natural resource extraction sites to rail lines and roads. Additionally, they would put into effect a, quote, one-window approvals process to fast-track approvals for large-scale, national interest infrastructure projects. They also promised to work to speed up approvals for the construction, commissioning, and operation of a new Indigenous majority-owned Cedar LNG processing facility. They say they would invest $175 million in the Hudson Bay Railway and at the Port of Churchill in Manitoba. The Conservative Party say that they would create an office to handle all regulatory approvals across all levels of government. They say that only one application and one environmental review would be required for each potential resource project. The party would also limit wait times for those approvals to 1 year. They also promised to commit $1 billion over 3 years to the construction of a road connecting First Nations communities and the critical mineral deposits in the Ring of Fire to the Ontario Highway Network, while allowing companies investing in the Ring of Fire to pay a share of their federal corporate taxes to local First Nations. They would designate areas as shovel-ready zones to accelerate the construction of a liquefied natural gas project in Quebec. They plan on repealing the federal government's Impact Assessment Act, C-69, which allows federal regulators to consider the potential environmental and social impacts of various resource and infrastructure projects. Additionally, they want to create a national energy corridor that would make it easier to fast-track approvals for large-scale infrastructure projects. Finally, the party say that they would be open to exporting oil from the Port of Churchill. The Bloc supports a high-speed rail system that would connect Quebec to the city of Toronto. They say that they are against the nuclear waste disposal project in Chalk River, as well as an Energy East pipeline, which they say would impact Quebec ecosystems. The Bloc want the federal government to double funding for public transit and invest in the maintenance of public transit infrastructure currently in use, such as the Montreal Metro. And finally, the Bloc is advocating for the exploration of critical minerals in Quebec to respond to the rising demand from electrical vehicle manufacturing sectors. The NDP party say they would undertake a major construction program and require only Canadian steel to be used in all federally funded infrastructure projects. One of their major projects they would prioritize is creating an east-west electricity grid. They say they're also against building an LNG pipeline in Quebec and believe the province should have the right to veto energy projects on its territory. The NDP opposes the Energy East project but isn't shutting the door to pipelines. They say that they would favor Canadian companies in the bid selection process, as well as suppliers and contractors with a unionized workforce. As part of their Build Canada plan, they'll increase the federal government's capital investment budget by $10 billion per year, investing in Canada's productive assets, including ports, rail, highways, and Arctic infrastructure. Topic 4. Crime and Justice. The Liberal Party say that they would shift the burden of proof to the accused to make it harder for people charged with violent car theft, organized crime, home invasions, and certain human trafficking and smuggling offenses to get bail. They say they would also upgrade murder charges involving intimate partner violence and sexual violence to a constructive first-degree murder offense and criminalize the distribution of non-consensual sexual deepfakes. They would increase penalties for the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. The Liberal Party says they would also recruit 1,000 more RCMP personnel, open a new RCMP academy in Saskatoon, and increase pay for cadet recruits. They say they would increase funding for the Public Prosecution Service of Canada to prosecute drug production and trafficking offenses. In order to protect children from online sexploitation and extortion, a Liberal-led government says they would raise the maximum sentence for child luring. They say they would extend how long data related to child sexual offenses needs to be preserved and extend the period for these cases to be prosecuted. In order to tackle hate-related crimes, the Liberal Party would introduce legislation to criminalize intentionally obstructing access to any place of worship, schools, and community centers. They would make it a criminal offense to willfully intimidate or threaten those attending services within those sites, and it would increase the annual budget of the Canada Community Security Program. The Conservative Party also discussed how they would approach crime and justice if they were put into power. The Conservative Party say they would use the notwithstanding clause, which gives legislatures in Canada the power to override portions of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to introduce consecutive sentences for offenders convicted of multiple murders. They say they would put in place a 3 strikes and you're out law to make criminals convicted of 3 offenses ineligible for bail, probation, parole, and house arrest, and give them a minimum sentence of 10 years. They also plan on designating those criminals as dangerous offenders in order to prevent their release until they prove they are no longer a danger. The Conservative Party plans on imposing mandatory life sentences on anyone involved in the trafficking, production, and distribution of over 40 milligrams of fentanyl. They say they would create a new offense titled assault of an intimate partner in order to, quote, deliver tougher sentences for anyone who abuses an intimate partner. They would require strict bail conditions for anyone accused of intimate partner violence, such as mandating the use of GPS ankle bracelet monitoring, and any breaches with that resulting in immediate imprisonment. They would ensure that killing of an intimate partner, one's own child, or a partner's child would be treated as first-degree murder. The Conservative Party also said that they would redirect Canada Revenue Agency resources towards targeting offshore tax havens, creating a name and shame publication to expose corporations evading taxes. Additionally, they plan on expanding the offshore tax informant program and giving whistleblowers up to 20% of the recovered funds when they report illegal tax schemes. Finally, Conservatives would pass a Stop Scamming Seniors Act to hold banks and telecom companies accountable. They would also plan on introducing a $5 million fine for companies if they do not use the latest technology to stop scams, and mandatory jail time and fines for fraudsters in order to financially ruin them. The Bloc Québécois says they support harsher sentences for crimes related to intimate partner violence and family violence. They say that they are against the federal use of the notwithstanding clause. The party say they would amend the criminal code to prevent the Jordan ruling from being invoked in cases of serious crimes. They would also reinstate minimum sentences for crimes committed with firearms, while allowing judges to make exceptions at their discretion and with cause. They want to create a registry for criminal organizations and would table a bill to crack down on child luring. They plan on using elements of Bill C-63 and Bill S-210 in order to tackle the problem of child pornography. They say they would table a bill to make platforms responsible for the content they host. They also seek to put a time limit on the federal government to fill judicial vacancies. They say they would modify the criminal code in order to eliminate the allowance of hate speech when it's based on religious expression. The party would also work to define, quote, transnational repression in the criminal code to prevent states from monitoring, intimidating, and repatriating dissidents. The NDP party say that they would end tax agreements with known offshore tax havens like Bermuda and require corporations to provide, quote, a genuine business reason for using offshore accounts in order to try to prevent tax evasion. The NDP promised to implement public country-by-country financial reporting in order to try to prevent multinational corporations from hiding their profits. Topic 5. Guns. The Liberal Party say that they would revive the gun buyback program for assault-style firearms. They would automatically revoke gun licenses for individuals convicted of violent offenses, especially intimate partner violence. They also plan on legislating a requirement for the RCMP to classify new firearm models entering the market instead of the gun industry. They add that they would increase funding for the RCMP's National Forensic Laboratory Services and the Saskatchewan Ballistics Laboratory to better track down guns used in crimes. And finally, the Liberals say they would bolster the capacity of provincial chief firearms officers in order to strengthen the enforcement of yellow and red flag requirements. The Conservative Party say that if they were put into power, they would reverse the Liberals' gun buyback program. They say that they would allocate resources, technology, and add at least 2,000 border agents, extending the powers of the Canada Border Services Agency. Finally, they say to intercept car thefts as well as gun and drug trafficking, the Conservatives would install high-powered scanners at all major land crossings and shipping ports. The Bloc Québécois say that they would continue calling for better control of illegal firearms while ensuring that those laws don't restrict the rights of hunters or the sport hunting industry. The NDP say that an NDP-led government would hire back at least 1,100 border officers to stop the illegal flow of firearms into Canada. Topic 6. Indigenous communities. The Liberal Party say that they would seek partnership and consult with Indigenous leaders on how to build Canada's economy and identify opportunities for Indigenous participation in major projects while respecting Indigenous rights. They say that they would set aside $94 million to upgrade power plants in Cambridge Bay, Joahaven, Igloolik, and Iqaluit. They would also allocate $74 million to improve and develop housing. They say they would put down $20 million toward helping the Nunavut Nukiksati Corporation complete the first phase of the development of its hydroelectricity facility. Finally, they promise to continue funding Jordan's Principle to support First Nations children and have said that fixing the child welfare system is a top priority. The Conservative Party say they want to repeal C-69, the federal government's Impact Assessment Act, which requires respecting the rights of Indigenous people when assessing resource projects. They say they would approve federal permits for mining in Northern Ontario's Ring of Fire. The Conservatives would incentivize First Nations to support resource development projects through industry taxes. They say they would support an optional First Nations resource charge, which allows First Nations to directly collect tax revenues based on the use of their ancestral lands. Finally, the party supports the implementation of Jordan's Principle to support First Nations children. They say that they would put back on the table a $47.8 billion First Nations child welfare reform deal. The Bloc Québécois say that they would continue to defend Indigenous people's right to self-determination and work to ensure that the federal government follows the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They say that they would work on implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. They add that they believe the greatest obstacle to Indigenous people's self-determination is the Indian Act, so they would support anyone willing to envision a future without the Act while respecting the wishes of Indigenous people. They say that they're in favor of investments for promoting Indigenous languages, cultures, and traditions, and that they would work to end federal underfunding of Indigenous police forces. They would keep fighting for access to safe drinking water on reserves, would push for investments in climate-resilient housing for northern communities that are confronted with permafrost thaw, and finally, they would support renewing funding for Indigenous guardians. The NDP party say they would support the Nunavut Housing Corporation plan to build 3,000 housing units. They say that they would pave the Cambridge Bay runway in Nunavut to help make air travel more affordable and reliable. They say they would work with local partners and the territorial government of Nunavut on the Kivalliq hydrofiber link, a terrestrial and telecommunications link, to improve energy security and northern sovereignty. The parties say they would aim to complete construction of a deepwater port in Nanisivik, Nunavut. They would attempt to re-establish a full-time military base in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, set up a base in Iqaluit, as well as a new CAF reserve unit in Whitehorse. They also plan on working with Indigenous communities and the territorial government to establish more deep water ports, including in Qikqtarjuaq and Grays Bay. The NDP also say that they would fully adopt the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and implement recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Finally, the party supports the implementation of Jordan's Principle to support First Nations children. They want the federal government to co-develop a process with the National Children's Chief Commission for future negotiations on First Nations child welfare. Topic 7. Media policy. One of the major talking points that's come up during this election is whether or not the federal government should continue to fund CBC Radio Canada. The Liberal Party hoped to enshrine and protect CBC Radio Canada by introducing legislation to establish statutory funding. They hope to strengthen CBC and Radio Canada's mandate by developing a governance plan with CBC Radio Canada to improve accountability, empower leadership, streamline processes, and tap into the spirit of innovation, by equipping them to further promote and support Canadian culture, by strengthening local news so that all Canadians have access to timely, relevant, and reliable news, by adding to their mandate the clear and consistent transmission of life-saving information during emergencies, by including a commitment of including Indigenous perspectives, by fully equipping CBC and Radio Canada to combat disinformation so that Canadians have a news source they know and trust, as well as by bolstering innovation and investing in new digital tools so that they can deliver the news when and how Canadians want it. They plan on providing an initial $150 million boost in annual funding while directing CBC Radio Canada to develop a strategic plan consistent with this new mandate. They also say they plan on supporting Canadian artists and creators by increasing funding to agencies such as the Canada Council for the Arts, Telefilm, the Canadian Media Fund, and the National Film Board. The Conservative Party say that they will support media freedom by introducing a Freedom of Speech Act to repeal what they call liberal censorship laws and, quote, restore Canadian news on Meta and other platforms, by boosting the local journalism initiative by $25 million for local news, by ensuring all domestic government advertising dollars are spent on Canadian platforms only, by providing $25 million in support for Indigenous language media, and by supporting remote area internet connectivity so every Canadian has reliable access to news. They say that they will save by defunding the CBC and reforming Crown corporations while maintaining Radio Canada services. They argue that English language CBC should be a Canadian-owned, self-sufficient media organization that is not for profit and supported by listeners, donations, sponsorships, ad revenue, and licensing revenue. The Bloc Party's platform proposes the transfer of all powers relating to arts and culture to Quebec, alongside the creation of a Quebec Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, or CRTQ for short. Additionally, they want all funds related to these powers previously exercised by the federal government. They say that in the meantime, they will introduce a bill to require the CRTC to consult Quebec or the provinces concerned before any regulation affecting cultural specificity. Additionally, they say they will oppose the cancellation of the digital services tax called for by Trump. They add that they will support the modernization of CBC Radio Canada, conditional on greater independence between the French and English language networks. They'll also demand that all of the public broadcasters' online content, including Tout TV Extra and specialty channels, be free and accessible, as well as strengthen its role in regional coverage. And finally, the Bloc will propose a review of grant programs so that funds are better directed to organizations and broadcasters that directly support local artists and culture. The NDP say that they would expand support for the CBC and for local journalism, which they say is critical during this time of misinformation, disinformation, and U.S. threats. As mentioned at the beginning of the episode, there are a lot more policies and points made within each of these parties' platforms, so we encourage you to go read them, and you can find them linked within the description of this episode. Thank you for listening to this episode focusing on how major federal parties plan on addressing some of the issues regarded as domestic policy in this upcoming election.
You're tuned in to CJSW 90.9 FM's 2025 federal election coverage. To listen back to full episodes, please visit cjsw.com or download the CJSW mobile app available for iPhone and Android.